A silent girl, a haunted cowboy, a corrupt sheriff, and one secret that could bring an entire county to its knees. In the unforgiving Texas frontier of 1878, Clara Kaufman arrives with no voice, no family, and nowhere to go. Gideon Vance is a man trapped by the ghosts of war. Together, they must face corruption, violence, and a past determined to destroy them. But when the moment finally comes, the woman who has been silent for nearly a decade will speak, and her words will change everything. This is more than a Western. It is a story about courage, justice, redemption, and the extraordinary power of finding your voice. If you're ready for an unforgettable journey, like, comment, share, and subscribe to join our growing community of Western story lovers.
The sun didn't just rise over Millhaven. It dropped down like a hot brass plate by 9 in the morning. The pine boards of the depot platform were already sweating resin, the smell sharp and sticky in the stagnant air. Clara Kaufman stood right where the train had left her 3 hours ago. She was backed up against a single timber trunk, her hands folded over the handle of her battered valise. Her gray dress was faded to the color of river silt, but it was clean. She kept her chin up, eyes fixed on the shimmering horizon where the iron rails melted into the heat. Ranchers passed her by, men with leather-skinned faces and dirt under their fingernails. They looked her up and down, checking the sturdiness of her frame the way they eye a mare at an auction. Barney Fletcher, the station master, wiped his neck with a checkered rag and tried again. He stepped up to a burly cattleman in a sweat-stained Stetson. She's quick with a needle. Frank, and she can read a ledger clear through, Barney said, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of the morning. The orphanage in Abilene sent her down. Honest work is all she's after. The cattleman took a step toward Clara. She looked a bit slight for hauling water. Hey there, girl. You know how to skin a rabbit. Clara didn't blink. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulled out a small slate and a piece of chalk, and wrote 3 words in clean, elegant script: I can learn. The man stared at the slate, then looked at Barney, his mouth souring. She's cam. A dummy, she's mute, Frank. Barney snapped, his voice dropping an octave thick with reprimand. Not deaf, and sure as hell not a dummy. American law doesn't give you the right to treat a free human being like damaged freight just 'cause she keeps her mouth shut. The cattleman snorted, turning on his heel. A ranch needs a woman who can yell when the coyotes get into the chickens. Don't bother, Barney. Clara watched him walk away. Her hand didn't shake. She took a rag, wiped the slate clean, and wrote, 3rd rejection. Still not angry. Almost. Barney read it, a sad, dry chuckle rattling in his throat. He looked at her with a heavy sort of pity. But Clara didn't want it. She looked away, back to the dirt road. Then came the noise. A freight wagon, overloaded with cedar posts, came rattling around the corner of the livery stable. The teamster was angry, cursing at his mules, his heavy leather whip cracking through the air like a volley of pistol shots. Crack, 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 across the platform. A man had just stepped out of the freight office. Gideon Vance. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a sun-bleached canvas coat and a low-slung Colt. But at the sound of the whip, Gideon stopped dead. His boots froze on the planks, his right hand twitched, dropping instantly toward the grip of his revolver, his knuckles turning white, his chest heaved, his eyes wide and glassy, staring right through the wagon, right through the town, seeing a completely different sky, a sky filled with grapeshot and the screams of dying men. Sweat broke out on his forehead, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The townspeople didn't notice, they never did. They just thought Gideon Vance was crazy. Clara noticed. She didn't run. She didn't call for help. She walked forward, quiet as a shadow, and stepped directly between Gideon and the street. She stood there, her slight frame blocking his view of the cracking whip, her back to the noise. She didn't touch him. She just held her slate up, right where his panicked eyes could see it. Written on it was one word: Earth. Gideon's gaze focused on the white chalk. He blinked, the gravelly, suffocating fog of 1,865 slowly clearing from his brain. He looked down at the girl. She was small, but she was solid. She wasn't looking at him like he was a madman. She was just holding the line for him. He took one long, shuddering breath, his hand relaxed. Coming away from his gun, Vance, Barney called out, breaking the spell as he walked over, squinting in the sun. You here for that fencing wire? Gideon nodded once, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Yeah. Barney looked from Gideon to Clara, then rubbed the back of his neck. He took a gamble. He pulled Gideon a few feet away, leaning in close. Gideon, look here. I know you re-out on that high ridge all by yourself. The Blackwood place needs a woman's touch, and this girl needs a roof. She works hard. I guarantee it, Barney sighed, his tone turning cautious. But she's mute. Gideon, don't bother. Most men already walked away today. It's too much trouble for 'em. Gideon didn't look at Barney. He looked past him, straight at Clara. She had gone back to her timber trunk. She wasn't begging with her eyes. She wasn't crying. She was just waiting, perfectly still. A pocket of absolute peace in a world that wouldn't stop shouting. Gideon turned back to the station master. His face was a mask of worn flint, but his eyes were steady. Silence. Gideon's exactly what I crave. He walked over to her trunk, hoisted the heavy thing onto his shoulder with one movement, and looked down at her. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask if she could cook. He just jerked his chin toward his buckboard wagon. Clara followed him. She climbed up onto the hard wooden bench. Gideon sat beside her, picked up the reins and gave them a gentle shake. The wagon rolled out of Millhaven, the iron-rimmed wheels crunching into the red Texas dirt. The town began to shrink behind them. Gideon didn't say a word. Clara didn't write a thing. For the first time in 3 long years, the air around Clara didn't feel heavy with shame. She was just a person on a wagon. Heading home, the red dirt road didn't ask for much. It just stretched out under the belly of the sky, long and empty, until the pine trees of Millhaven gave way to the low, scrubby cedar of the high plains. Gideon kept his eyes between the horse's ears. He didn't try to break the quiet. Most folks filled the air with empty chatter just to keep from hearing their own thoughts. This girl didn't. The iron wheels kept up a steady, rhythmic crunch-shuck against the stones. It was the only sound for 12 miles. When the wagon finally slowed, the Blackwood place rose up from the dust. It wasn't a grand estate. It was a 3-room cabin built from hand-hewn post oak, the logs grayed by the harsh Texas sun. A sturdy barn stood to the west, its roof patched with tin. 40 head of longhorns grazed near the creek, their wide horns catching the late afternoon light. It was a lonely place, a hard place, but the timber was straight and the perimeter fence was tight. Gideon pulled the team to a halt by the porch. He swung down, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. We re-here, he said. He didn't offer her a hand up, not out of malice. Out of respect. In the territory, if a person could walk, you let them use their own legs. Clara understood. She swung her boots over the bench and stepped down, her knees stiff but her posture straight. Gideon shouldered her heavy trunk and led the way inside. The cabin smelled of old wood, tobacco, and dried prairie grass. It was clean enough, but it had the hollow feel of a house where no one ever laughed. He set the trunk down in a small, square room tucked right behind the iron cookstove. This is yours, Gideon said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. The door has an iron latch on the inside. It stays closed when you want it to. Clara looked around. A narrow rope bed, a small washstand, a window that looked out toward the western ridge. It was small, but it was a room with a door. Gideon stood in the frame, his hands tucked into his belt. Rules are simple. I'm up at 5. Supper is on the table at 6. I don't need your life story, and I don't reckon you want mine. Do your work well, and you'll find $5 silver on the mantel every Saturday night. That's the law of this house. Clara pulled the small slate from her apron. The chalk made a sharp, clean scrape against the stone. Where is the well? Gideon looked at the white letters. He gave a nod. 50 yards behind the kitchen. The bucket is cedar. Keep the lid on it or the field mice will find a way in. Clara didn't waste time. She tied her apron tighter, took the bucket, and walked out. Gideon watched her from the porch. She didn't hurry, but she didn't dawdle either. She worked with a quiet, deliberate rhythm. When she lowered the bucket into the dark of the well, she didn't struggle with the windlass. She used her weight against the crank, her boots planting firmly into the dirt. By dusk, the cabin looked different. A man living alone leaves things where they drop. A saddle blanket on a chair, a tin cup by the window. Clara didn't move his things out of spite, but she put them where they belonged. The blanket went to the porch peg. The cup was scrubbed with sand and lye water until the tin shone under the grease lamp. Gideon sat at the heavy oak table, an old leather-bound volume open under his thumb. It was his father's copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. Clara walked past to place a bowl of cornmeal mush on the table. Her eyes caught the legal print. Her footsteps slowed. She looked at the Latin phrases in the margin, her gaze lingering on the heavy typography. She didn't look puzzled. She looked like she was recognizing an old friend. Gideon noticed. He closed the book with a soft thud. "My father was a judge back in Missouri before the war," Gideon said, his voice flat but loud in the small room. "He used to say the law is the only thing that keeps the wilderness from swallowing a man whole. He spent 10 years teaching me how to read these pages so I wouldn't get cheated by land sharks." Clara stood by the stove. She picked up her slate, her fingers moving quickly. "My father was a schoolmaster. He taught me the English law and the German script." Gideon read the words. He felt a strange prickle at the back of his neck. The folks at the depot had called her a dummy. They thought an empty mouth meant an empty brain. "A schoolmaster," Gideon murmured. "Then you know more about the world than most of the drunks hanging around the Millhaven saloon." Clara gave a single sharp nod. She wiped the slate with her thumb, leaving a gray smudge on her skin. He picked up his spoon, but before he could eat, he drew the evening paper from his coat pocket, the Texas Sentinel. He laid it flat on the table. The lead headline was bold and black: "Sheriff Logan Vance restores order in Oakhaven County. Lawless squatters removed from Southern Ridge." Gideon cleared his throat. "Looks like my cousin Logan is making a name for himself down south. Cleaning up the county, the paper says." Clara looked at the newspaper. She didn't just read the headline. She stared at the name Logan Vance like it was a scorpion on her plate. Her breath caught. A sharp, ragged gasp left her throat, the first human sound Gideon had heard her make. Her hand twitched, striking the edge of her tin plate. The plate didn't break, but a sharp piece of iron wire on the rim caught the meat of her thumb. Blood, bright and red, welled up instantly, dripping onto the clean pine table. Gideon stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. He reached for her hand, but Clara pulled back, her face turning white as flour. She squeezed her injured thumb against her apron, her eyes wide with a sudden wild terror. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just backed into the corner of the kitchen, her lips pressed together so hard they turned blue. Gideon stopped. He held his hands up, open and empty. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low, dropping it down to the register he used for skittish colts. "Hey, look at me. You're at Blackwood now. There's nobody here but the cattle and the wind." Clara's shoulders were shaking, but she kept her teeth clenched. She wouldn't let a sound out. Not one. Gideon stepped back to the washstand, took a clean piece of linen flour sacking and laid it on the table. He walked back to his chair and sat down, giving her space. "Out here we don't apologize for accidents," Gideon said, his voice steady as an anchor. "A tin plate can be hammered straight, a table can be scrubbed, but a person's skin needs tending. Take the linen, Clara. Bandage the hand." Clara looked at the cloth. She looked at Gideon. The wildness in her eyes slowly died down, replaced by that familiar, stubborn wall of iron. She stepped forward, took the cloth, and wrapped it tight around her thumb. She didn't write anything else that night. When the lamp was blown out, the cabin grew dark and still. Gideon lay on his narrow bed in the main room, listening to the rafters groan as the night wind came off the caprock. For 10 years, his nights had been filled with the sound of phantom artillery. He'd wake up sweating, waiting for the ceiling to collapse from a mortar shell that wasn't there. But tonight, the house was different. It was quiet, a deep, heavy kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of a graveyard. It was the silence of two people keeping watch against the dark. And for the first time since the spring of '65, Gideon Vance fell asleep without his hand on his gun. By the 3rd week of May, the prairie grass had turned from green to the pale, dusty gold of a mountain lion's pelt. The heat was steady now, rising from the earth in long, shimmering waves by midday. The ranch had found its stride. They didn't have words, so they built a language out of lumber and iron. Clara spent an afternoon in the barn with a pocket knife and some scraps of cedar shingle. When Gideon came in for noon water, he found a row of small wooden pegs fixed to the wall beside the kitchen door. Above each peg, Clara had carved a short phrase in neat English block letters: "Need floor, barn door broken, supper ready, stranger at the gate." Beside the pegs hung a handful of small wooden rings. If she needed something, she simply looped a ring over the proper peg. Gideon stood before the board for a long minute, his hands tucked into his back pockets. A slow, rare smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "My father used to say that a man who can adapt to his tools is a man who will get broken by them," Gideon said, looking over at her where she stood by the iron pot. "The law calls it utility. I call it good sense. You saved us both about 10 miles of walking and a whole lot of pointing, Clara." Clara didn't smile, but she gave him a brief, approved look before turning back to her bread dough. The real test came on a Tuesday. Gideon was out by the western line fence, sweating through his shirt as he dug a post hole through clay and rock. Back at the cabin, Clara was hanging washed linens on the wire line. A sudden sharp rattle tore through the brush by the creek. A young longhorn bull, his hide scarred from old brush fights, and his eyes rolled back in a fit of summer madness, had broken through the willow thicket. He was a bad-tempered beast, 500 pounds of bone and sharp horn, and he was heading straight for the garden patch where Clara stood. A normal woman would have shrieked. She would have dropped the basket and screamed for the man with the rifle. Clara didn't have a scream. She didn't run either. If you run from a bull on the open plain, you turn yourself into bait. Clara dropped her linen, turned toward the porch, and snatched up 2 heavy cast-iron pot lids from the outdoor wash bench. She stepped right into the bull's path, her feet planted wide in the dirt, and slammed the heavy iron together. Clang, clang, clang! The sound was like a blacksmith's hammer hitting an anvil right between the beast's ears. The bull stopped so hard his hooves skidded in the red dust. He lowered his head, blowing snot, his small eyes blinking in confusion. Clara didn't back down. She took 2 steps forward, her face grim, and slammed the iron lids again. Clang. The bull decided he didn't want any part of a gray-skirted creature that made the noise of a foundry. He wheeled around, his tail tucked, and bolted back into the willow brush. Gideon came riding in 3 minutes later, his horse lathered into a foam, his Winchester drawn. He had heard the iron clanging from half a mile away. He swung down, his eyes sweeping the yard until he saw the bull's tracks in the dirt, then looked at Clara. She was calmly picking up her fallen pillowcases, the iron lids sitting on the porch steps. Gideon slowly lowered the hammer of his rifle. He looked at the tracks, then at her. "You didn't yell," he said, his breath coming hard. Clara pulled her slate from her apron. "Noise is noise. The iron speaks louder than my throat ever could." Gideon read it, a sudden understanding clearing the distance in his eyes. "You've got the machinery, Clara. You just don't use the pipes. You're fully capable of making a racket when the world comes pushing at you." She looked at him, her gaze steady, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a revelation. Her silence wasn't a broken gear in her throat. It was a choice, a wall she had built to keep the horror out. But she knew exactly where the gate was if she ever needed to defend the camp. 2 days later, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The air grew thick and heavy, the kind of stillness that makes the horses bunch up in the corner of the corral with their heads low. By 4 in the afternoon, the wind died completely. Then came the green light tornado sky, Gideon said, standing on the porch, his eyes fixed on the low, tumbling clouds to the west. "But it ain't a twister we're getting. It's a blue norther with hail." They hurried to secure the property. Gideon drove the milk cow into the sturdy log barn while Clara cleared the porch. Before they could finish, the sky ripped open. It wasn't rain. It was a sudden violent barrage of ice. Hailstones the size of musket balls came screaming down from the clouds, smashing against the oak shingles like a continuous line of infantry fire. Whack, whack, whack. A sharp, jagged bolt of lightning struck the old cottonwood tree by the corral, the thunder following instantly with a roar that shook the stone foundation of the cabin. Inside the barn, Gideon went down. The sound, the sudden deafening roar, the smell of sulfur from the lightning, the relentless battering of the ice was too much like the 3rd day at Palmito Ranch, the gray mud, the grape shot tearing through the timber. Gideon dropped his rifle. He fell into the straw of the empty stall, his hands flying up to cover his ears, his head tucked down between his knees. His chest was heaving so hard his shirt threads groaned. He couldn't see the logs of his own barn. He was 13 again, covered in black powder smoke, drowning in the roar of big guns that wouldn't stop. The barn door creaked open. Clara came through the storm, her shawl soaked, her face splattered with gray mud. She saw him. She didn't shout his name. She didn't try to pull his hands away from his head. A person in the middle of a fit like that doesn't want to be handled. It feels like being captured. She walked into the stall and sat down right in the straw beside him. She didn't crowd him. She just leaned her shoulder against his arm, letting him feel the solid, cool weight of her presence then. She took her right hand, laid it flat against his forearm and pressed down. Not a grip, just an anchor, a steady, unmoving point of iron in the middle of his storm. Gideon's breath hitched. He felt the cold mud on her skin. He felt the firm, quiet pressure of her hand. Slowly, the smoke of 1,865 began to drift away, replaced by the smell of wet hay and cedar shavings. He raised his head, his face gray and streaked with sweat. The hail was still drumming on the roof, but it was just ice now. It wasn't grape shot. He looked at Clara. Ice was inches from his. Her gray eyes were perfectly calm, holding his gaze like a steady hand on the reins. "I'm sorry," Gideon whispered, his throat raw. "The noise, it takes the wheel. I can stop it." Clara didn't reach for her slate. She didn't need to. She just kept her hand pressed against his arm, her thumb tracing a slow, rhythmic circle against his skin. In, out, still here. Gideon let out a long, ragged sigh, his head falling back against the timber wall. "The medical men call it a soldier's heart," Gideon said into the dim light of the barn, his voice shaking just a bit. "They say the spirit gets bruised by too many detonations. The law doesn't have a name for it. The judges back home just called it cowardice. But it ain't that, it's just. The ears don't forget what the eyes had to look at." Clara looked at him for a long, quiet minute. She reached down into the straw, found a scrap of pine shingle that had fallen from the loft, and used a rusty nail to scratch 2 words into the soft wood. "I know." Gideon looked at the scratched letters. He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't ask what kind of storm had driven the words from her own throat 9 years ago. He just laid his hand over hers. Their fingers cold from the Texas ice, but steady against the timber floor. The Texas didn't care about a man's history. It just burned. By June, the golden yellow prairie grass had baked down to a crisp, pale white, rattling like dry corn husks whenever the south wind crawled up from the brush country. Gideon stood by the corral post, a heavy leather gun belt draped over his forearm. He was a man for unnecessary pastimes, but the territory was changing. The law was thin on the high plains, and an empty holster was an invitation for every loose-riding drifter between the Brazos and the Rio Grande. Clara was on the porch, her small hands busy snapping dry bush beans into a tin bucket. Tick, snap, tick. Gideon walked over, his boots kicking up little puffs of red dust. He laid the gun belt flat on the oak washbench. Beside it, he placed his old Civil War issue Colt Army revolver, an iron piece with the bluing worn entirely off the cylinder. "Clara," he said, his voice cutting through the dry heat. "Come here." She set the bucket down without a sound and walked to the edge of the porch. Her gray eyes looked at the iron weapon, then up at his face. "Every free citizen has a right to secure their own life under the Constitution," Gideon said, his voice flat, rhythmic. "But a right ain't worth a damn if you don't know how to wield it. The sheriff is 30 miles away. If a stray wolf comes through that gate, you can't hit it with a slate." Clara looked at the heavy pistol. She didn't reach for it. Her fingers twitched against her apron, her face hardening into that familiar stubborn mask. "I know it's heavy," Gideon said, picking up the piece by the walnut grip. He held it out, cylinder open. "But iron is the only currency the frontier respects. Here, take the balance of it." Clara hesitated, then stepped down off the porch. Her fingers closed around the grip. The weight of it immediately pulled her wrist down. It was a Soldier S gun, built for killing horses and breaking bones. Her arm trembled, her thumb struggling to reach the heavy spur of the hammer. Gideon stepped up behind her. He didn't crowd her, but he placed his broad, sun-browned hands over hers, steadying the iron barrel. "Don't fight the weight," he murmured near her ear, his breath warm against the dry wind. "Let the bone of your arm carry it straight down through your hip. That's mechanical leverage. Squeeze the wood. Don't pull the trigger. Let the hammer fall like it was an extension of your own thumb." They stood like that for 3 long minutes, their breathing settling into the same slow, quiet rhythm, under the heat of his palms. Clara's trembling stopped. She held the iron steady, pointing it toward an old flour cask 60 yards out by the gully. Gideon stepped back, letting her take the full weight. "You have the eye for it. I seen you watch the hawks. You look right through a thing to see where it's going." Clara lowered the gun, her chest rising and falling. She pulled her slate from her pocket and scratched the chalk against the stone. "The iron remembers too much." Gideon read the words, then looked out over the dry hills. The sun was dipping low now, turning the rim of the caprock the color of dried blood. He sat down on the edge of the porch, his boots in the dirt. He didn't look at her, he just looked at his own hands. "I was 13 when the regiment took me in," Gideon said, his voice dropping down to a low rhythmic drone, like a man reading a legal ledger in an empty room. 1865. The war was already dying. But nobody told the men in the mud. I was just a courier, a boy on a gaunt mule with a leather pouch across my chest. He paused, the wind whistling through the cedar shingles above them. "They gave me a dispatch at the crossroads, told me to ride hard into the southern valley. Give the paper to the artillery captain." I did it. I rode until the mule cleared blood from its nose. I handed the captain the ink. Gideon's knuckles turned gray as he gripped his own knees. 10 minutes later, the big guns opened up on the timber below. We didn't know there was a settlement of German immigrants down in the creek bottom. Families, folks who didn't even speak the language of the state. The grape shot tore the cabins right into splinters. I stood on the ridge and watched the smoke rise. I carried the paper that killed them. Clara, I've been carrying those dead children on my back for 10 years. The silence came back, heavy and suffocating. A grasshopper clicked in the dry weeds. Clara stood perfectly still. She didn't write immediately. She looked at Gideon, at the gray in his hair, at the deep, permanent lines around his eyes. She didn't look at him with pity. Pity was cheap. She looked at him with the sharp, cold intelligence of a person who understood how machinery worked. She sat down on the dirt step beside him. She took the slate, her chalk scraping hard and fast, leaving white dust on her skirt. She laid the stone flat on his knee. Palmito Valley, she wrote. Gideon blinked. Yeah, how do you know the place? Clara wiped the stone with her palm, her face grim. She wrote again, her hand moving with a strange, fierce certainty. The orders were signed by General Slaughter at noon. I read the campaign logs in my father's books. The artillery was already moving before you left the crossroads. You were a boy on a mule, Gideon. You delivered the weather, but you didn't make the rain. Gideon stared at the slate. He read the words once. He read them twice. His father had taught him that the law required an unbroken chain of causation to prove guilt. If the act was set in motion before the agent arrived, the agent was merely a witness, not the cause. They were already moving. Gideon's voice was barely a whisper. Clara nodded once, her gaze holding his with the force of an iron clamp. She reached down, took his large, calloused hand and turned it over. She picked up a mumble of dry earth from the ground and dropped it into his palm, then closed his fingers over it. The earth knows who dug the trench, she wrote on the margin of the stone. It wasn't you. Gideon looked at his closed fist. For 10 years. His mind had been a crowded courtroom where he was both the prisoner and the hanging judge. But looking at her neat, precise script, the iron chain around his chest didn't break, it just seemed to turn to rust and fall away into the dirt. He didn't say thank you. Out here. You didn't thank a person for giving you the truth, you just lived by it. He stood up, took the leather gun belt, and hung it back on the porch peg. The twilight took the valley, gray and cool. And for the first time since he was a boy in Missouri, Gideon Vance walked into his house without looking behind him. The heat of July brought the land sharks. In 1878, Texas was rewriting its books. The old Spanish grants and the pre-war certificates were being dragged into the county seats, where men with clean fingernails and high-braced trousers looked for errors in the margins, if a fence line was 5 feet off, or if a dead man's signature lacked a notary seal. The land went back to the state or into the pockets of the men who ran the courthouse. Gideon had to ride 30 miles north to the salt works to secure 3 tons of winter alfalfa before the prices doubled. It was a 2-day trip with the heavy wagon. Keep the bar across the door after sundown, Gideon said as he hitched the team. He looked at Clara, his eyes serious under his hat brim. The law says a man's home is his castle, but a castle don't mean much if the gate is left swinging. Clara nodded, her hand resting on the cedar pegboard she had made. She pointed to the peg marked stranger at the gate, then to the Colt revolver sitting on the kitchen table. Gideon gave a short approved nod, gathered the reins and drove the team out into the morning haze. By noon of the second day, the silence of Blackwood Ranch was broken by the sound of a fine leather harness. Clara was in the side yard, turning a sheepskin rug over the rail to beat out the dust. She heard the iron tires before she saw the buggy. It wasn't a working wagon. It was a high-sprung, yellow-wheeled phaeton, drawn by a pair of sleek black geldings that had never pulled a plow in their lives. The man driving wore a black broadcloth coat despite the 90-degree heat. He had a star made of beaten Mexican silver pinned to his vest. Sheriff Logan Vance. He pulled the horses to a stop right by the well. He didn't get down immediately. He sat back, his white hands holding the leather reins lightly, his eyes sweeping over the clean yard, the patched barn roof, and finally settling on Clara. Clara stood by the rail, the heavy wooden rug beater in her hand. Her heart gave a sudden violent leap against her ribs, a cold, oily dread flooding her throat. She knew that buggy. She knew that sleek, soft way of sitting. 9 years ago, San Antonio, the smell of flour and wet tallow. A man with that exact same silver star had stood over her father's desk while the wood burned around them. Logan tied the reins to the brake lever and swung down. His boots were polished black leather, not cowhide. He walked toward the porch, his mouth curved into a pleasant courtroom smile that didn't reach his small, pale eyes. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Logan said, his voice smooth as river grease. "Gideon around. I have some papers from the Oni land office that need his mark." Clara didn't move. She didn't reach for her slate. She just stood there, her gray eyes turning into two pieces of flint. Logan stopped 5 feet away. He looked at her faded dress, her golden brown hair pinned back with a cedar splinter, and then his gaze traveled down to her right wrist. There was a small white, star-shaped scar there, the mark where a splinter from a shattered flour barrel had torn her skin when she was 9 years old. The sheriff's smile didn't leave his face, but his eyes narrowed until they looked like two slits in a leather hide. "Well now," Logan murmured, taking a slow step closer. "The station master down at Millhaven told me Gideon picked up a stray from the Abilene home. Said she didn't have no tongue." He leaned in, his voice dropping down to a dry whisper. "Kaufman. That was the name on the San Antonio manifest back in '69. A schoolmaster who didn't know when to sign a quitclaim deed." Clara's breath went cold. Her thumb found the grain of the wooden rug beater. She didn't run. If she ran into the cabin, he'd follow, and the law would say he was just executing county business. Logan reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a folded blue paper. "This here is an official notice of title review under the Reconstruction Land Act of 1876. Gideon's deed has a bad signature from the 70 registrar. Hat Oakhaven is reclaiming the northern section of Blackwood for the railroad right-of-way." He tapped the paper against his palm. "A mute girl don't mean nothing to a Texas grand jury, sweetheart," Logan said, his voice flat, rhythmic, legal. "The statutes say an unsworn witness who cannot undergo oral cross-examination cannot present evidence in a criminal dispute. You're a ghost under the law, Clara. You don't exist in the book of judgments. Remember that before you start making marks on that little stone of yours." He laid the blue paper on the porch bench, gave his hat brim a polite twitch, and walked back to his yellow-wheeled buggy. He didn't look back as he drove out, the black horses kicking up a long, lazy cloud of red dust that hung in the air for an hour. Clara stood by the rail until the dust settled. Her hand was shaking so hard she dropped the rug beater into the dirt. She walked into the kitchen, her knees weak but her jaw locked tight. She picked up the blue paper from the porch. She didn't need Gideon to read it to her. Her father had taught her that the law was just a language made of ink. If you knew the grammar, you could see where the knife was hidden. She sat at the oak table, her slate before her. She wrote out the name Logan Vance. Then she took her thumb and smeared it until the black stone was clean again. She wasn't a ghost. She had a name, and for the first time in 9 years. Clara Kaufman looked at the iron revolver on the table and didn't see a weapon of war. She saw a pen that could write a final judgment in the sand. The axle grease was cold when Gideon got back from the salt works. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, leaving a purple bruise across the sky. He parked the heavy supply wagon by the barn, his shoulders slumped from 2 days of hard driving against a headwind. He didn't find Clara at the clothesline. He found her inside, sitting at the oak table by the light of a single tallow candle. The blue paper was lying right between her elbows. Gideon walked in, his boots leaving gray tracks of dust on the clean pine floor. He didn't say hello. He just looked at her face, then at the legal notice. He picked up the paper, his rough thumb trailing over the official seal of the Oakhaven County Land Office. As he read the words clerical invalidity, title reclamation, immediate forfeiture, the veins on the back of his neck began to swell like river roots. "Logan," Gideon said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, gravelly register. Hitting the table with his open palm, he made the iron spoons rattle in their jar. "He is using the 76 Act. He wants the water rights on the Northern Creek for the cattle syndicate. He's been doing it all across the county." He turned on his heel, his face dark as a thunderhead, and reached for his Winchester rifle hanging over the hearth. "The law don't mean a damn thing when the judge is buying the bullets." Gideon growled, his hand closing around the oiled walnut stock. "I'll ride into Millhaven tonight. I'll settle this deed, the way my father settled things in Missouri when the bushwhackers came to the gate." He didn't make it to the door. Clara moved like a prairie hawk. She didn't shout, but her body slammed into his path, her slight frame pinning his arm against the log wall. Before he could push past, she snatched the heavy rifle right out of his grip. She didn't look scared, she looked furious. She threw the Winchester onto the rope bed, walked back to the table, and dragged his father's old copy of Blackstone's Commentaries right into the candlelight. She took a mumble of charcoal from the stove hearth and wrote in large, jagged block letters across the flyleaf of the law book, "Legal Recourse." Gideon stood by the door, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. Recourse. Logan owns the county registrar, Clara. He's got 3 deputies with silver stars and Winchester repeaters. You think a judge is going to look at a piece of paper when Logan Ass is standing there with the county seal? Clara didn't flinch. She sat down, her fingers moving across the pages of the old book with a strange, rapid precision. She found a specific section under the Federal Homestead Act of 1862, tapped her finger against the text, and began to write on her slate. Gideon walked over, his anger cooling into a cold, suspicious curiosity. He leaned over her shoulder, his breath coming slower now as he read her neat script. The eviction notice cites Section 4 of the local registry. Clara wrote, but under the Homestead Act, a federal patent overrides a county clerical error if the tenant has maintained continuous cultivation for 5 years. The error is technical, not substantial. Logan is banking on your ignorance of the supreme statute. Gideon stared at the slate. He looked from her white chalk letters to the heavy Latin print in his father's book. His father had told him once that a rogue with a badge always counts on an honest man's fear of the uniform. The federal patent, Gideon murmured, his voice leveling out into a steady cadence. The county can't reclaim what the federal government already signed over. He's running a bluff. Clara nodded once, her eyes sharp as needles. She wiped the stone clean and wrote again. He forged the signature of the circuit judge on the review warrant. I know Judge Parker's mark from my father's San Antonio files. Parker uses an open quill stroke. This is a tight steel pen. It's a fraud. Gideon let out a long, slow whistle. He sat down in the chair opposite her, his hands flat on the table. For 3 weeks. He had looked at this girl as someone he had saved from the platform at Millhaven. He had thought he was the one providing the fort, the meat, and the protection. But looking at her now, with the candle smoke curling around her fierce, intelligent face, he realized the truth. She wasn't a dependent, she was a partner. My father used to say that a man who fights with lead alone is a man who will end up in an unmarked grave, Gideon said, looking straight into her gray eyes. He said the law is a tool of iron, and the man who knows how to hold the handle can break the man who only knows the blade. You aren't just cleaning my kitchen, Clara. You're fortifying the whole damn ranch. Clara looked at him, her jaw relaxing just a fraction. She reached out, took the slate, and wrote one final line before turning down the lamp. I don't need a savior, Gideon. I need an ally who can ride. Gideon gave her a short, solemn nod. He reached over, took the Winchester off the bed, and walked to his own corner. The anger was gone, replaced by something cold, durable, and exact. They weren't just 2 lonely people sharing a roof anymore. They were an army of 2. By August, the Texas air had turned to liquid iron. The wind died completely, leaving the high plains under a white haze that made the eyeballs ache. It was the month of the county fair in Millhaven, the one day of the year when the lonely ranchers from 40 miles around dragged their wagons into town to trade wool, sell beef, and drink corn whiskey until the sun went down. Gideon had to go. If they didn't sell the 10 head of steers he could corralled by the creek, they wouldn't have the cash to buy winter salt and kerosene. We going in together, Gideon said on a Thursday morning, his face clean-shaven for the first time in 2 months. Logan will be there with his men. If we file the counter-warrant with the circuit clerk while Judge Parker is in town, Logan can't touch us without violating federal procedure in front of 50 witnesses. Clara didn't hesitate. She wore her gray dress, but she had washed her apron until it was bright as a new cloud. She tucked her slate into her pocket and climbed up onto the buckboard seat before Gideon could even finish hitching the team. The 6-mile ride into Millhaven was a gauntlet of dust. Every crossroad sent up another wagon, another family, another cloud of red dirt until the air smelled of hot leather and horse sweat. 2 miles outside the town limits the noise began. It started as a dull, rolling rumble, the sound of hundreds of iron tires grinding against stone, the shouting of teamsters, the distant frantic barking of town dogs. To a normal man, it was just the sound of a holiday. To Gideon, it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. His fingers began to tighten on the leather reins until his knuckles turned gray. His breathing went short, his chest hitching every time a wagon passed them by with a shout. The old gray fog of the war was creeping up from the back of his neck, making his eyes wild and skittish. Clara watched him. She saw the muscle in his jaw jumping. She saw his boots pressing hard against the floorboards, ready to bolt. Before the wagon hit the first line of houses, Gideon pulled the team into the shade of an old post oak tree. He set the brake with a loud, mechanical clack. He didn't look at her. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out 2 small, round wads of raw white cotton, dirty and stained with tobacco dust, but packed tight into small cylinders. He raised his hands and stuffed them deep into his ears, down until his fingers came away red from the pressure. He turned his head toward her, his face pale under his sweat-stained hat. "The noise," Gideon said, his voice sounding strange and muffled even to himself. "The shouting, the blacksmith's hammer. It triggers the soldier's heart. Clara, if I don't muffle the world, I can't keep my hands from shaking. I can't think straight enough to find the clerk's office." He looked down, ashamed. In Texas, a man who couldn't stand the sound of a crowd was looked at like a broken mule. Clara didn't look away. She didn't look down at him with that soft, sickening pity he had seen in the eyes of the army doctors. She stood up on the floorboards of the wagon, reached out her small hands, and took his face between her palms. Her skin was cool against his burning cheeks. She gently turned his head to the left, looked at the cotton plug that was sticking out too far, and used her thumb to press it firmly into the canal. She adjusted it until it was snug, then did the same to the right. She didn't use her slate. She just looked right into his gam eyes, her own gaze steady as an iron spike, and gave him a slow, firm nod. Gideon let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. With the cotton in his ears, the roar of the town became a distant, harmless hum like the sound of bees in a distant clover field. The noise couldn't reach his brain anymore. It couldn't trigger the phantoms of 65. "When I shut out the shouting," Gideon whispered, looking up at her, "I can finally hear what's real, and it tells me to stand right here with you." They drove into Millhaven like two ghosts passing through a carnival. The town was a roaring sea of color and sound. Children ran between the wheels. Men argued over the price of cotton, and a brass band was playing on the courthouse steps. Gideon sat on the bench, his eyes calm, his hands steady on the reins. He didn't flinch when a blacksmith's hammer hit an iron tire 10 feet away. He just steered the wagon through the crowd, Clara sitting straight beside him like a queen on a lumber cart. They reached the county courthouse by noon. As they stepped onto the wooden planks of the porch, the crowd parted. Sheriff Logan Vance was standing by the heavy oak double doors, his silver star polished until it caught the glare of the white sun. 3 deputies stood behind him, their thumbs hooked into their cartridge belts. Logan looked at Gideon's ears, his eyes fixing on the white tufts of cotton sticking out beneath his hat brim. A cold, mocking smile broke through his mustache. "Well now, cousin," Logan said, his voice coming to Gideon like a distant hollow echo through a stovepipe. "You brought your dummy to town for the judging. I left some papers on your porch. I reckon you didn't have the ears to hear 'em." Gideon didn't look at Logan's mouth. He looked at Logan's hands. He kept his own pace steady, walking straight up the steps until he was standing face to face with the sheriff. "The federal patent on Blackwood is registered in Austin, Logan," Gideon said, his voice remarkably calm, loud enough for the gathering crowd of ranchers to hear every syllable. "We filed the counter warrant with the circuit clerk 5 minutes ago. Judge Parker signed it before he went to dinner." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a copy of the stay of eviction, and slapped it flat against Logan's silver star. "The law says you can't touch a rail on my fence until the federal review is complete," Gideon said, his eyes drilling into the sheriff's pale face. "You try to cross my gate before then, and Judge Parker will have you in the state penitentiary for land fraud before the frost hits the ground." Logan's smile went entirely white. He looked at the paper, then at Clara. Clara didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just reached into her apron, pulled out her small slate, and held it up right before the sheriff's nose. Written on it, in clean, unmoving script, was a date. October 14, 1869. Logan looked at the numbers. The blood went out of his lips so fast his mustache looked like charcoal against flour. He took a step back, his hand falling away from his gun belt, his eyes staring at Clara like she had just risen from a fresh grave in the middle of the street. Gideon didn't wait for him to speak. He took Clara by the elbow, turned his back on the sheriff, and walked down the steps into the white dust of the square. The town was still shouting, the brass band still playing, but as they reached the wagon, Gideon looked at her and knew the truth. They hadn't won the war, yet Logan would come with fire before the month was out, but they had drawn the line in the dirt, and they had done it without a single word passing between them. The night didn't bring cool air, it just brought darkness. The smell of scorched cedar and wet ash hung over Blackwood Ranch like a heavy wool blanket. By 2 in the morning, the fire in the hay barn was down to a dull glowing red eye in the dark, surrounded by the black ribs of the timber frame. Gideon sat on an upturned pine crate in the middle of the yard, His face was black with soot. His shirt torn at the shoulder where he had fought the sparks with a wet gunny sack. His hands hung down between his knees, raw and blistered from the heat. Beside him stood the iron wash tub, the water inside gray and fouled by the cinders. Clara walked out from the kitchen, her footsteps light in the dust. She carried a jar of lard mixed with baking soda, the old frontier remedy for a fire scald. She didn't ask him how it hurt. She just sat on the dirt beside his boots, took his right hand, and began to spread the cool grease over the raw skin with her fingers. Gideon didn't flinch. He just watched her hand move. They used kerosene on the back sills, Gideon said, his voice a low, dry rattle in his throat. I found the tin down by the creek. Logan didn't even try to hide the tracks. He wants me to know the badge don't stop at the fence line when there's money to be made. He looked toward the blackened remains of his winter feed. The law calls it arson with intent to displace, Gideon murmured, his words falling into a slow, rhythmic cadence. But out here, it's just a slow hanging. A man without hay in November is a man who'll be skinning his own cows by January. He's starving us out, Clara. Clara kept her head down, her fingers working the lard into his blisters. She didn't look up until she had wrapped both his hands in clean strips of flour sacking. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out a fresh piece of pine shingle she had split from the woodpile and a lump of charcoal. She wrote with sharp, heavy strokes, the wood groaning under the pressure. We have the logs. Gideon let out a dry, humorless chuckle. The logs. The county registrar won't look at your father's books, Clara. Logan will have the grand jury under his thumb by Tuesday. He'll say the fire was a stray spark from the forge. And he'll have 3 deputies swear they saw me drinking in Mill Haven when it started. He stood up, his legs stiff, looking toward the dark outline of his horses in the corral. You need to take the buckboard and go north to the church at the salt works, Gideon said, his voice flat, direct. Muxa Aldous can keep you safe. He's got the church sanctuary behind him. And even Logan won't shoot a woman under a steeple. This ranch is turning into a slaughterhouse, and I won't have your blood on the ledger. Clara didn't move. She sat in the dirt, looking up at him through the dark haze. Her gray eyes weren't wild. They were cold and steady as winter creek stone. She stood up, walked over to the blackened wall of the remaining tool shed, and used her lump of charcoal to write one word across the oak timber in letters a foot high. No. Gideon stared at the black mark. Clara, be reasonable. I have the Winchester, but my hands are raw. If they come back with 4 men instead of 2, Clara snatched the charcoal back. She didn't write on the shingle. She wrote right beneath her first mark on the shed wall, her hand moving with a fierce rhythmic anger. You stood by the fence when the whip cracked, she wrote. You didn't run from my shadow. I don't run from your fire. Gideon read the words by the dim red light of the dying barn. He looked at the soot on her face, at the stubborn set of her jaw. His father had told him once that a contract wasn't a piece of paper signed in a parlor. It was a mutual covenant to endure the winter together. If one party walked before the frost, the agreement was void from the beginning. A mutual covenant, Gideon said, his voice softening into the quiet of the plain. That's what the old books call it. It means the risk belongs to both, or it belongs to none. Clara dropped the charcoal into the dust. She walked over, took his bandaged right hand, and pressed her palm against his wrapped knuckles. She didn't squeeze, but she held it there until his shoulders dropped and the tension left his neck. All right, Gideon whispered into the dark. We stay, but we don't wait for the next match. By the time the first gray light of morning broke over the caprock, they were at the oak table. Clara had 3 separate ledgers open under the lamp, her father's old personal journals from San Antonio, the 1,869 land registry maps she had kept in her trunk, and Gideon's father's copy of the Texas statutes. She began to build the brief. Gideon sat beside her, his bandaged fingers holding the inkwell steady while she dipped her steel pen. She didn't write about her grief. She didn't write about the blood on the floorboards 9 years ago. She wrote dates. She wrote land description numbers. She wrote the names of the 7 German families who had lost their properties within 3 months of her father's death, all of them deeded over to the same land syndicate Logan Vance had formed before he ever wore a star. The pattern of fraud, Gideon said, his eyes following her nib as it moved across the paper. My father always said that a thief can hide one tracks, but he can't hide the trail of his own hunger. If you show the court that the method was the same every time, the individual deed don't matter. The whole system becomes a conspiracy under federal law. Clara gave a single sharp nod. She wrote a final paragraph at the bottom of the brief, her script tight and clear, then handed the pen to Gideon. He took it between his wrapped fingers. His teeth clenched against the pain of the blister and signed his name at the bottom of the complaint. Gideon Vance, freeholder. The sun and white burning away the smoke of the night. They didn't sleep. They packed the ledgers into Clara's leather valise, hitched the team to the buckboard, and turned the horses back toward Millhaven. The road was long, and the dust was red, but as the town steeple rose from the brush, Gideon looked at the iron box between Clara's boots and knew they weren't going to a market day anymore. They were going to a reckoning. The Oakhaven County Courthouse was nothing but a two-story box made of green pine boards, but today it held the weight of the state. The small courtroom on the second floor smelled of cedar shavings, wet wool, and tobacco spit. Every bench was packed with ranchers from the Ridges, men with gray hair and patched trousers, waiting to see who would own the dirt beneath their boots by sundown. Circuit Judge Parker sat behind a plain pine table at the front of the room. He was a small man with an ink-stained vest and eyes like two black beads behind his steel-rimmed spectacles. He didn't look like an instrument of majesty, but he held the federal commission under his hand. Sheriff Logan Vance stood by the jury box, his silver star catching the glare of the noon sun through the unwashed window. His three deputies stood by the door, their thumbs hooked into their belts, their faces bored and heavy. Gideon sat at the small table to the left, his bandaged hands resting flat on the wood. Clara sat beside him, her leather valise on her knees. Case number 42, Judge Parker said, his voice sharp as a dry twig breaking. The matter of the Blackwood title review. Sheriff Vance presents the county forfeiture warrant under the Act of 1876. Gideon Vance presents a federal stay. Logan stepped forward, his leather boots creaking loudly on the pine floorboards. He laid a thick stack of blue papers on the judge's table. The county registry is clear, Your Honor, Logan said, his voice smooth, carrying over the murmur of the crowd. The original entry from 1870 lacks the required notary seal from the district office. Under the statute, an unsealed entry is a nullity. The land reverts to the public domain for the railroad development. The defendant has been notified, and he has failed to produce a valid state certificate. He turned his head toward Gideon, his mouth twisting into that cold, satisfied smile. The law don't look at sweat, Your Honor, Logan said, looking back at the judge. It looks at the ink, and the ink on the Blackwood deed is dead. Judge Parker adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the papers, then looked over his rims at Gideon. Mr. Vance, you have the federal stay, but the court cannot maintain an injunction if the baseline title is defective under local registry law. Do you have evidence of continuous federal patenting prior to the state omission? Gideon started to stand, but before his boots could hit the floor, Clara laid her hand flat against his arm. She stood up. The courtroom went entirely still. A man in the second row cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tight air. Logan Vance let out a short, dry snort from the jury box. Your Honor, Logan said, his voice dripping with courtroom charity. The girl is a mute from the Abilene home. She don't have no standing in this room. The Texas Code of Criminal and Civil Procedure is explicit on the matter. An unsworn person who is incapable of oral cross-examination cannot present testimony or introduce evidence in a record dispute. She's a ghost under the rules. Judge, she can't speak, so she don't exist. Judge Parker frowned, looking down at Clara. Miss Kaufman, the sheriff has stated the rule correctly. The court is bound by the statute of presentation. If you cannot take the oral oath, I cannot accept your ledgers into the record. Clara didn't reach for her slate. She left it in her pocket. She walked forward until she was standing right at the rail of the witness box, her hands folded over her gray dress. Her chest gave a long, deep heave. Her jaw twitched, the muscles in her neck turning tight as fence wire. For 9 years, her mouth had been a sealed tomb, the iron gates locked by the memory of a smoking room in San Antonio. But looking at Logan's silver star, looking at the gray hair of the ranchers on the benches, she didn't see her own fear anymore. She saw the law. She opened her lips. The sound that came out was a terrible ragged rasp, like the sound of an iron spade striking stone after a long drought. It was tho rop, it was broken, but it was clear. My name, Clara said, every word costing her a shudder of her shoulders, is Clara Kaufman. A sudden, sharp gasp tore through the back of the courtroom. Barney Fletcher, the station master, stood up from his bench, his mouth wide open. Logan Vance froze by the jury box, his face turning the color of belly fat. I am the daughter, Clara said, her voice growing stronger, finding a deep, steady rhythm that filled the pine rafters of Wilhelm Kaufman. I am the sole survivor of the San Antonio massacre of October 14th. 1869. She raised her right hand, pointing her scarred wrist straight at Logan S. face. I watched that man enter our house, she said, her voice ring like an anvil strike in the silence. I watched him sign the forged quitclaim deed while my father lay on the floorboards. I have been silent for 9 years, Your Honor, but the law is not silent today. Logan's hand flew down toward his holster. She's lying. The girl is a lunatic. She's been cam since she was a child. You can't take the word of a crazy immigrant over a county officer. Sit down, Sheriff. Judge Parker roared, slamming his wooden gavel down with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. He stood up behind his table, his beads of eyes fixed on Clara. Miss Kaufman, you understand that by speaking before this bench, you are putting your person under the full weight of the perjury statutes of this state. I do, Your Honor, Clara said, her voice level now, clear as well water. And I submit my father's original journals, along with the federal registry maps of 1869, to prove the conspiracy of land fraud in Oak Haven County. She stepped to the table, took the ledgers from her valise, and laid them flat before the judge. Gideon Vance stood at the left table. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the crowd. He reached up, took the 2 plugs of white cotton from his own ears, and dropped them into the dust of the floorboards. He didn't need the muffle anymore. The noise of the world was still there, the shouting of the deputies, the murmuring of the ranchers, the pounding of the judge's gavel, but through the middle of the storm, he had heard the only voice that mattered. Judge Parker turned the pages of the old journal for 3 long minutes. The room was so quiet you could hear the flies buzzing against the glass. Finally, the judge looked up, his face grim as a hanging notice. The federal stay is maintained, Judge Parker declared, his voice cutting through the heat. Furthermore, under Section 12 of the Judicial Code, I find probable cause of title forgery and official misconduct. Sheriff Vance, you will surrender your Silver Star to the circuit clerk immediately. You are remanded to the custody of the federal marshal for transfer to the grand jury at Austin. The courtroom broke into a roar like a river breaking a dam. Ranchers stood on the benches, throwing their hats into the air, shouting until the pine walls shook. Logan Vance looked at his own deputies, but the men had already stepped away from his side, their hands clear of their belts. A Texas deputy knows when the rope has cleared the branch. Han unpinned his beaten Silver Star, dropped it onto the pine table, and walked out between the marshals with his head down. Gideon walked forward to the rail. Clara was still standing there, her shoulders shaking just a bit now that the iron had left her throat. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide and bright. He didn't say she had done well. He didn't tell her she was brave. He just took her right hand, the one wrapped in his father's flour sacking, and led her out of the crowded room, down the wooden stairs, and into the clean, quiet sunshine of the Texas square. The frost came early to the high plains that autumn. By November, the red dirt of the wagon road had hardened into gray, stone-like ridges that rang like iron under the horses' hooves. The wind down from the caprock was thin and clean, carrying the scent of distant snow and dry cedar smoke. Blackwood Ranch was quiet again. But it was a different sort of quiet now. The black ribs of the burned hay barn had been cleared away. In their place stood a new frame, built from fresh green pine logs hauled down from the northern breaks. It wasn't as large as the old one, but the timber was straight and the roof was double shingled against the winter hail. Gideon stood by the new barn door, a wood rasp in his hand. His fingers were still scarred from the August fire, the skin shiny and pink in places, but the blisters were gone. He was working on a flat piece of cedar plank, smoothing down the edges until the grain showed clean and white. Clara walked out from the cabin, a tin coffee pot in her hand. She didn't carry her slate anymore. It sat on the mantel inside, right next to his father's law book, the surface wiped clean of gray chalk dust. She poured the hot black chicory into his tin cup. She didn't speak immediately. Her throat was still tender, her voice a low, soft register that she used only when the house was still. The wind is turning north, she said, her words coming with that small, rhythmic pause between sentences, like a person counting her steps across a narrow footbridge. The cattle are bunching by the willows. Gideon took the cup, the hot tin warming his scarred palm. He looked toward the creek bottom where the longhorns stood with their backs to the breeze. They have the instinct for it, Gideon said, his voice level, steady. A beast don't need a calendar to know when the ice is coming. The law calls it natural providence. My father used to say it's the only contract that don't need a notary seal. The land promises the winter, and the creatures prepare for it. He pointed his wood rasp toward the cedar plank on the bench. He had carved two names into the wood with a small pocket knife, Vance and Kaufman. Beneath the names, he had cut a new title for the homestead, Running Water Ranch. The registry office in Austin sent the finals yesterday, Gideon said, looking down at the wood. The old name of this place was born out of a bad deal and a broken spirit. I reckon a true title ought to reflect the thing that keeps the camp alive. The creek is clear, and the patent is signed by the federal governor. Nobody can scratch our names out of the book now, Clara. Clara looked at the carved cedar. She reached out, her thumb tracing the deep grooves of her own last name. She didn't cry. A person who has spent 9 years in the desert doesn't waste water on wood. But her jaw relaxed, the permanent line of tension between her brows smoothing out in the gray light. It's an equal covenant, she said, her voice small but distinct against the wind. That is what the statute requires for a lawful partnership. 2 names on the deed, 2 pairs of hands on the plow, an equal covenant. Gideon repeated, giving a slow nod. That's exactly what it is. They didn't have a grand wedding in the town saloon. A frontier marriage didn't need a brass band to make it stick. On a Tuesday morning, Muksu Aldous rode down from the Saltworks church, his old black Bible tucked into his saddlebag. Barney Fletcher came along in his yellow station buggy, wearing a clean white shirt that smelled of lye and starch. They stood on the porch of the cabin, right where the blue eviction notice had lain 3 months ago. The Mook Sioux read the verses from the Book of Ruth, his voice carrying over the empty prairie. When it came time for the vows, Gideon didn't look at the preacher. He looked at Clara's gray eyes. His hands were bare in the cold air, completely steady. The phantom artillery of Palmetto Ranch didn't fire in his ears today. The world was just gray dirt, green timber, and the woman standing before him. I take you for the winter, Gideon said, his voice flat, solemn, rhythmic, and for the grass that comes after. Clara took a breath, her fingers closing tight around his scarred hand. I stay, she said, her voice clear as the creek stone. Where you die, I will be buried. Barney Fletcher wiped his nose with a red handkerchief, cursing the dry dust under his breath, though there wasn't a grain of dirt in the air. The Mook Sioux signed his name to the marriage certificate on the kitchen table. Barney made his crossmark as the lawful witness, and by noon the old men were riding back toward the main road. The evening came on fast, the sun dropping behind the caprock like a cold iron slug. Gideon built a heavy fire in the cook stove with seasoned post oak until the iron top glowed red. They sat at the table, the bowls of beef stew steaming between them. They didn't talk much. When a language is built out of 9 months of absolute trust, you don't need to waste words on the salt or the bread. After supper, Gideon wrapped his canvas coat around his shoulders and stepped out onto the porch to check the corral latches one last time before the hard freeze. The sky was a deep, velvet black, crowded with thousands of cold stars that didn't give any heat. The prairie stretched out around the cabin for 50 miles in every direction, dark, silent, and indifferent to the small candle burning in the window. Clara walked out behind him, her heavy wool shawl tucked around her neck. She stood right beside his shoulder, her boots planted firmly on the oak planks. The world out there was still dangerous. The law was still thin. The cattle thieves were still riding the borders, and the court at Austin was 3 days away by hard horse. The frontier hadn't grown soft just because Logan Vance was in a federal cell. Clara leaned her head against his canvas sleeve, her breath making a tiny white cloud in the frosty air. It's still loud out there, she whispered into the dark, her voice resting against the quiet hum of the night. The world, I mean. The shouting in the towns, the trouble on the road. Gideon turned his head, his face catching the faint amber light from the kitchen window. He looked down at her golden brown hair, then out at the empty hills. He didn't have his cotton plugs in his ears. He could hear the wind whistling through the new barn eaves. He could hear the longhorns lowing in the bottomland. But his hand didn't drop to his holster, his chest didn't go tight. Yeah, Gideon said, his voice steady as a timber beam. It's loud. He put his broad, scarred arm around her waist, pulling her close against his side until he could feel the rhythmic beat of her heart against his own ribs. But not here, he said. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. They had both learned the same truth, the hard way, through the fire and the ink. Silence is not the absence of words. It is the presence of trust. And trust, they had discovered, was the loudest thing in the world if you knew how to listen. While this story may be inspired by historical settings, frontier life, or cultural traditions, it is not intended to serve as an accurate historical account. Creative liberties have been taken to improve storytelling, character development, pacing, and cinematic atmosphere for entertainment purposes.
As our story comes to an end, we are left with something far more valuable than a victory in a courtroom, a restored ranch, or even a hard-earned marriage. We are left with a reminder that some of the strongest people in this world are not the loudest voices in the room. Sometimes the strongest souls are the ones who have suffered in silence, endured unimaginable loss, and still found the courage to trust again. Clara Kaufman's journey teaches us that silence should never be mistaken for weakness. For years, she carried pain that most people could never understand. She lost her family, lost her voice, and lived in a world that constantly underestimated her. Yet she never surrendered her intelligence, her dignity, or her belief that truth still mattered. Her story reminds us that a person's value is not determined by what others can see on the surface. True strength often lives quietly beneath the scars, waiting for the right moment to rise. Gideon Vance offers a different lesson, one that speaks to anyone carrying guilt, regret, or wounds from the past. For years, he blamed himself for tragedies he did not create and punished himself for events beyond his control. Like many people, he carried burdens that were never truly his to bear. Through Clara's friendship and trust, he learned that healing does not begin when the past disappears. Healing begins when we finally tell ourselves the truth. We are not always responsible for every storm that passes through our lives. Sometimes survival means learning to lay down a weight that was never ours to carry. One of the most powerful messages in this story is the difference between protection and partnership. Gideon did not rescue Clara because she was helpless. Clara did not heal Gideon because he was broken. Instead, they became allies. They stood shoulder to shoulder against injustice, fear, and corruption. They proved that the strongest relationships are not built on one person saving another. They are built on mutual respect, shared burdens, and the willingness to walk through hardship together. The story also reminds us that the law, justice, and truth are not always the same thing. There are times when powerful people manipulate rules for selfish gain. There are moments when honest voices are ignored simply because they are inconvenient. But history repeatedly shows that truth has a remarkable way of surviving. Lies may win a season. Corruption may hold power for a time. Yet eventually, courage, evidence, and integrity shine light into the darkest corners. Clara's decision to speak after 9 years of silence reminds us that one brave voice can change the course of an entire community. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is found in the final words of the story. Silence is not merely the absence of sound. Real silence is trust. It is the peace that exists when two people no longer need to hide from each other. It is the comfort of knowing that someone sees your scars and stays anyway. In a world filled with noise, judgment, fear, and endless demands, that kind of trust is one of the rarest treasures a human being can ever find. As we leave Running Water Ranch behind, we remember that healing is possible, justice is worth fighting for, and no person should ever be defined by the worst thing that happened to them. The future belongs to those who keep walking forward, even when the road is lonely, even when their voice shakes, and even when the world tells them to give up. Because in the end, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep moving despite it. And just like Clara and Gideon discovered beneath the vast Texas sky, the strongest foundations are built not on power, wealth, or reputation, but on truth, loyalty, and the quiet promise that no one has to face the darkness alone.